For those of you I haven't met, my name is Toby Hertzlich. I'm the founder of Biomimicry for Social Innovation. And we are a nonprofit whose purpose is to bring forward nature's intelligence as evolutionary practices for those of us who are working on the people side of things, and to connect other people who are doing the same thing. So I'm super pleased today to have Margo Farnsworth with us, the author of today's book, Biomimicry and Business, How Companies Are Using Nature's Strategies to Succeed. And Margo, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Tell us just where you're from, and that will get you on people's first screen, where I will suggest that they pin you so they can always get a view of you as we're having this conversation. So
okay. Thank you, Toby, and thank you to Biomimicry for Social Innovation for not only having me, but having this whole series. I have loved seeing the other women who have come before me. And like you, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous people from my neighborhood, primarily the Kansa, but also the Shawnee, the Wyandot, and about 100 other tribes from around here. And we just finished putting in a National Science Foundation grant here. I'm in Kansas City, and so hopefully we'll be working with the University of Missouri and Kansas University and developing food forests with the indigenous people from around here. So thank you for starting out that way.
I'm just putting the.
If you're not on mute, put yourself on mute so that we can.
It's outside our room.
Maybe Jen, maybe you can support that a little bit. For those of you who are watching, one thing that you might want to do is you can toggle back and forth between gallery view and speaker view. And I'd encourage you to put Margo as pinned on your first screen. And the way to do that is go up to Margo's picture, and take your cursor there, and there's 3 little dots, and you can click on that. And if you scroll down, it says pin, and that allows her to be visible to you while we're in conversation. Because Margo is our featured guest. And just a little bit about Margo Farnsworth. You're amazing. Margo is a biologist. She's a park ranger. She's been a naturalist. She's also been a water engineer, and teaches in the MBA program at Lipscomb University in Kansas City. She's a biomimicry educator. She's a consultant focused on sustainability and regenerative practices. And she's a writer and very much a storyteller. And we are really lifting up, Margo, your writing and storytelling today, and excited to do that. Just a couple other logistics before we jump in. Jennifer, you also see, maybe you can wave, Jennifer. Jennifer is our tech support. If you're having any problems getting in or getting booted out or wanting to contribute to the chat, you can give a private chat to Jennifer, and she will help you out. And she will be periodically, she also just posted her phone number. She'll be periodically putting things in the chat that are related to what we're talking about, like how to order Margo's book. And Margo, thank you for saying that you've been watching the whole series. For those who don't know, this is the Voices of Nature author series. And this is our 4th, I think, episode, maybe 5th. And our purpose in this series is to introduce usually new books from women authors who are bringing the voice of nature's intelligence out into the world at this time when we need it so much. And it's kind of a bit of a crowdsourcing support for getting these books out there. I learned along the way, as I met many authors, that it's a big job to get your book out. Once you've written it, then there's a whole secondary job about promoting it. And this seems like a way that we can support one another, as well as get to know the author and learn about the book. And I encourage you all to order this book and spread it, maybe order a couple copies and give it to somebody who might not yet know about biomimicry. But that's really the purpose here, is to get these voices out there, voices of women writers and voices of the natural world itself. This program is sponsored in part with, in partnership with Women Leading Change, which is another effort that I'm part of with a grant from the Novo Foundation. So thanks all around for that. So that's our purpose. Margo, anything else you want to say about your purpose in being here and saying yes to this before I start peppering you with questions?
You know that you talked about promoting the book after you write it, and I don't know for any of you in the audience too who are not big on self promotion. That was just like, I was excited to write the book. I was not excited about promoting it, except for the fact that a lot of us work together and we all work in different ways. And I know from looking in the crowd, there's some people here who are design folks, some people who are engineers, some people who are biologists, and we all have our own ways of moving into this work. And my way was to attempt to, because when I was teaching at Lipscomb, my MBA students were so excited about biomimicry, but then they would ask me the question, how do I get into it? How do I get it into my workplace? And so this book is very much not like other books you may have read that uh, give more of the technical details, because I tried very purposefully to put this all in layperson's language so that we could bring even more people under our tent. So, so I again thank you, Toby, for having me, because you make the promotions easier.
Oh, good, good. Again, this is the book that we're talking about. Somebody wrote in the chat, what's the name? It's called Biomimicry in Business. The subtitle is How Companies Are Using Nature's Strategies to Succeed. And I know, Margo, you just said you're not that into self-promotion, but I'm actually going to ask you some questions about yourself just to start, because these are people who write books. This is you who wrote this book. So, and understanding your own, where you came from, your own lineage, your own purpose is an important part of understanding this book. So, you describe yourself on your website as professionally as a hunter-gatherer. And I'm wondering what that means to you and how in that course of being a hunter-gatherer, you came to be exposed to biomimicry and fall in love with this work. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. I always spent time in the outdoors, whether it was exploring neighborhood creeks or, camping. And when I went to university, I wasn't quite ready to go out into the big wide world yet when I graduated. And so I worked for a backpacking store for a while and helped people, outfit themselves for climbing or whatever other outdoor pursuits, they were into. And finally I decided, okay, I guess it's time, I need to move along. And that's when I became a park ranger and had the good fortune to manage land in 2 parks. And after a while, it's so funny when I talk to Jay Harmon, who is the CEO of PAC Scientific. He talks about going through working for the government and then realizing that he couldn't have as big an impact as he wanted to. And that's not to say we weren't having impact as government workers, but it says something to the nature of the searching, searching for additional tools, searching for additional paths and ways into the community psyche. And so I worked for a corporation for a time, actually teaching science, and then was back in the naturalist business when I was like, okay, no, I don't want to work for a corporation. And I ended up in the nonprofit community. And it was during that time that I worked for Watershed Health, and began also teaching at the university, because what we taught through our non-government organization was that it was better to collaborate than to fight with each other. Jennifer and I were talking about a continuum of care earlier. And, you know, I think we need all the different players, you know, those people who are bringing lawsuits all the way, you know, to those of us who seek to collaborate and whatnot. But I felt like every move I made was in order to capture new tools so that I could help the earth better than whatever I was at that certain point. And that was very much how I came to write the book, was because my students were asking for those tools. And so I said, well, it's not out there. Guess I'll go make it.
And you chose to write a book about business, and you're teaching business students. You tell a short story in the very beginning of the book about your father being a businessman and how that was some inspiration to you and that you built on his ethic. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's, you know, not unlike a lot of people, you know, we have disagreements with the generation before, and you know, he had a very straight business way of looking at the world, and you know, serving the earth or serving anything else came second. And so I was very much brought up in that way of looking at things and appreciating it for what it brought to bear, but then over time sort of delineating what it could and could not do.
Yeah, you talked about the idea was business is about making a living, right? But then you've grown that ethic and you're actually challenging your readers to think about business, yes, as making a living, but maybe if we start learning about how other organisms are making a living on this planet and apply that intelligence, we can be doing, I think you talk about becoming a global citizen.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we look at even the term natural resources is kind of a business-like term, because it's resources for us, right? And what we really are is one of many, a multitude of organisms, all of which who bring something to the table when it comes to making this planet run and making this planet what it is. So I think just shifting the perspective a little bit and looking at business as a way to create a kind of a reciprocity for all the gifts that nature's organisms give to us, then being able to operate our business in a way that can give back. And I, you know, there's 3 levels. And again, Jennifer and I were talking about the continuum of care, and for the purposes of biomimicry and bringing business into this, there's a continuum that sort of has economic practicality at one end, and then social commitment. And then we can move to, and Robin Wall Kimmerer sort of, I think, has said it best when she talks about reciprocity and moving into ecological reciprocity. And I've worked with some major multinational corporations. I talk about Bridgestone a good bit in the book because I worked closely with them for years, but they moved into a space of ecological reciprocity. Having said that, you know, other multinationals have asked me not to use their name. And I've said, well, why? You're doing such great things here. I think of one in particular that you might have had some of their breakfast foods. And they were working to, they use a lot of water in their work. And they have their own water purification system on site. And they treat it twice, and then they have to pay the city to treat it a 3rd time. So I was helping them get the proper government okays that they needed to transfer that water, which all it had was sugar and flour in it, over to a golf course next door. It was a watershed that was dewatering. and so that they could use that water for other purposes. And it saved them money, and it saved the golf course money, and they were no longer dewatering their watershed by doing this. So, but they said, we don't want you to use our name, because then the environmentalists will look at us and look at what we're doing wrong. And so that kind of was a sad thing to me to hear, that here was a business that was doing something really good, but they were afraid to say it out loud for fear they'd be called on something else, which I'm sure it would be anyway. But
yeah, and you talk about in your book a lot, you mentioned the continuum of care, and that it's a spectrum, right? And that it's a developmental spectrum. And I think what I hear you saying in this story is, the challenge of if the company puts themselves out and says, we are doing this, and then they're going to be held to a very high standard that they're always going to have to meet, which might be a good thing for growth. But if you're partway along that spectrum and you're not fully there, in the case of this company, they were saying, we don't want to be challenged in that way quite yet.
no.
Can you say just a little bit more about the continuum of care and how you understand that and how you work with companies as they move along that continuum?
Well, one of the ways that I'm sure a lot of us have worked with biomimicry and all its cousins, bioinspiration, biotriz, biophilia, all the family, is figuring out how to get it into business. And so, as we were learning about biomimicry, for a lot of us, we were working with biologists, designers, and engineers. And I remember being down in Costa Rica, some of the first conversations we had was how we needed to come together and create a common language. And what came a little later to the party for a lot of us was that fourth language, and that was the language of business. And so, one of the first things that a majority of business people will talk to you about is the bottom line. And when they say the bottom line, they mean the bottom line of economics. Now, as we have evolved a little bit, we talk about the triple bottom line of profit, but also planet and people. And so now we can talk about it in a new way. But when you're very first talking to business people, that is usually not what you're talking about. And so, that was, one of the things, and I was very grateful to a good friend, Jacques Shirazi, had put together case studies. And so at the end of each chapter, you'll see economic benefits, social benefits, ecological benefits from each of these companies. But it always starts with the economics, because if they can't stay in business, then they can't do any good for any other part of the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes that's a good thing. Some things weren't meant to be around for a long time. But as you look at the companies who have actually deployed biomimicry and are using biomimicry successfully, you'll see that they do have positive benefits in all those ways.
One of the things I really appreciate about your book is how you talk about this continuum of care from economic practicality, as you're just saying. You've got to be able to keep your doors open. You've got to be able to stay in business to be able to give any kind of benefits. So it starts with economic practicality, then moving to social reciprocity. And you see that in a lot of business efforts, like let's contribute back to the community that holds us. Let's contribute to our consumers, our customers. So economic practicality, social reciprocity, and then ecological reciprocity. Did I get those three right?
Good.
And one of the things I love, Margo, is that as you're speaking to your business audience, you make it okay wherever people are on that spectrum, and pointing out that it is a spectrum, it is a continuum. And not only does moving up the continuum strengthen you as a global citizen, it also has economic benefits, it has reputational benefits, saves resources, makes things more efficient. So you keep making the case over and over again about the value of biomimicry in business. And I want to back up just a little bit because we just like jumped right into the meaty content of this. And by the way, folks, people who are out there, I'm seeing some people write some questions in the chat, some to me directly. I will definitely bring those forward. And if you have questions that you want everybody to see or comments, let's have the chat space be very active. You can be part of this dialogue. And after Margo and I have a dialogue for a bit, we'll save some time for questions directly from you as well. So this will be highly participatory. But I wanted to back up just a little bit. We talked quite a bit about who you wrote this book for. Who is the audience for this book? And why did you choose to, you said to me that you really wanted to open the door to new audiences. So I'm curious if you could share with this group who this book is written for, and also why did you primarily use storytelling as a modality? Describe that a little bit.
Well, as I said earlier, it was my MBA students who first sort of brought this whole question to my attention. And in a sustainable MBA program, which now thankfully there are getting to be more and more sustainability oriented MBA programs. But these folks worked for auto companies, they worked for construction companies, they were women returning to the workforce after raising a family. They were minors. It was this whole array of business professionals that came back because they were interested in doing their business, but doing it in a better way for the earth. And they weren't even considering people, although they were very lovely people, all of them. And so they did, but they were coming back to do better for the earth. And so, as I kept getting this question over and over again, and gave a lot of thought to them as students, I also thought, this would also be good for the tire kickers. Because generally, by the time any of us who are on this call, by the time we get to them, they are a little further along the pike usually. And I thought, what if we could, or I could write a book and start pulling those tire kickers in, those people that might be a little intimidated by the word biomimicry. I've heard, and if we could see everybody's faces, the show of hands for those of you who have said biomimicry to someone and the people have said bio what back to you. Almost everyone here, yeah. If you've worked in it at all. And so I was like, yeah, we need, and this isn't a matter of dumbing down, which is a conversation that I've had with a lot of not just our biomimicry colleagues, but also people that I've worked with in the water world, the water energy nexus. There's a lot of conversation about, well, we don't want to dumb it down. It's not a matter of dumbing it down. It's a matter of making it accessible. And, from the earliest times when human beings were sitting in a cave and were first learning language, that's when storytelling became a way of communicating. And, we talk about our indigenous neighbors, and that's how entire, oral histories are passed down. Stories are just more accessible. It's easier to remember details. I've worked with psychiatric populations and taught through story to those high schoolers and had such better progress with them because it wasn't just memorizing a specific date or how a specific mechanism works. It's putting it in a line to where you can make sense of a bigger picture. So, so that's who I aimed at. And from the biomimicry, the wonderful biomimicry books I had read to date, I hadn't really gotten that perspective from them, because there's so much exciting stuff to cover. And so it's so easy to go there and be there. And there's so much we have to learn. And so, you know, whether it's business books on biomimicry, investment books on biomimicry, particular company, you know, from a particular perspective, they've all been a valuable step. So I just thought, okay, well, this is one more stepping stone for us.
And for those who have not yet dived into this book, Margo tells the story of, I think it's four companies, five companies that have entered this world of biomimicry, starting with Nike and telling the story of how they embraced biomimicry and how that worked through their, maybe starting with bioinspiration and how that worked through their design process. And it's a story with characters and tension and breakthrough thinking, and it's suspenseful. Great story. Similar story with Interface and the story of Interface Carpet, which many people who've been around the biomimicry world for a while know that story, but not with this level of nuance. Pax Scientific, Jay Harmon's company. Again, we learn about Jay Harmon, how he started out as a boy, hanging out by the oceans and watching the spirals in the water. Who am I missing? Encycle, a company that was inspired by bees and swarm intelligence to do sensors for energy conservation. And who am I missing?
Sharklet.
Say it again.
And Sharklet.
Sharklet, of course. Sharklet Technologies, developing a bacteria shedding surface that's now used in hospitals and started in other ways. So this book is interesting because for me, I found that these were some references around biomimicry applications and biomimicry engineering that then had business success that I had heard about, but I never knew the stories. And I never knew the development and the sweat and the challenges and the angst and what it took to get there, the way that you laid this out. So I found that to be super useful. And when you refer to tire kickers, I think what you're pointing to is people who are kind of curious about biomimicry, don't yet know. So for those on this call, if there are people in your lives, especially who are in the business world, who are like, as Margo said, bio what? This is a great introduction, very comprehensive, to open the door for people who may be interested in, yeah, it's great to talk about nature, but how is it relevant for us? We're trying to make a business, we're trying to make a living, we're trying to bring products into the world, we're trying to bring new ways of working into the world. How can this be relevant? Well, there's stories in here that can guide you there. And Margo, I find this book to be both an expanded call, an expanded vision of what business can be in the world, and also quite practical. You have some very tangible, specific interventions about, for example, how to create green roofs on a big warehouse or a big factory, what people need to do, how to go about doing that, resources of who people can talk to if they're interested in pursuing this, while you're also saying, come on, it's these times, we're all needed, you're needed, we can do this, and guess what, it's good for your business too. That was where I heard you speaking. Mike, am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, we absolutely are all needed, and we all have something unique to ourselves to offer. And I think sometimes I'm guilty of this. I make it too hard. You know, and you know, some of the hobgoblins is what I call them, when we're looking at businesses who, a number of us who work together, colleagues and I, have this ongoing conversation about how do we get biomimicry out there further? How do we get it in the companies? What is going to make it work in a company? And what I have found from talking to companies themselves is when one of the cousins, biomimicry or any of its cousins, are not working, it is the great majority of those examples don't have anything to do with biomimicry or any of its cousins. It's for this, it's for business reasons. It's the same reason that businesses would usually fail. It has to do with that, not with the biomimicry itself. In fact, I have not spoken with a single company where biomimicry or whichever of its cousins is being deployed has failed. And so, you know, some of you who are watching today might know of some that have, but business is such a complex thing. And you know, when we talk about hobgoblins, about how it's difficult to get biomimicry into a company, maybe the kinds of advice, and you know, I talked with Darcy Winslow, was the first woman to head up the women's division at Nike. And she was also their first sustainablist. Aldo Leopold talks about recreationalists. And I told my students a long time ago, I made up the word sustainablist. And I said, it's a word now. So anyway, so Darcy is a sustainablist. And, you know, she had no budget when she started, you know, and didn't know anything about biomimicry. But it's, you know, you come to it. And so, but some of the first things you have to do are overcome things like hobgoblin number one, overcoming inertia. And that's with a lot of good ideas in business. That's one of the first things that you have to beat, as it were. You also have to deal with the fear of being wrong, whether it's your fear of being wrong, or whether it's your boss's fear of being wrong, or the team that you work with. And so these are much more difficult things than the actual bioinspiration elements that we work with, or the biomimetic elements that we work with, because we tend to kind of figure those things out first. It's like the guys at InCycle, you know, they were working on, you know, what this little transmitter could do. They had come up with the idea, you know, they were good there, and they had their big sheet of paper where they were trying to figure out exactly what energy problem they were going to solve. And they finally, you know, honed it down. And when they finally got right there, the thing that would, whenever they were failing, they figured out it was their stupid human tricks, is what they called them. And you know, they were like, oh no, we made a mistake in the math over here, or but they had taken the scientific and engineering concept to the point where that was all right. Then they went out to ask the experts, you know, to get more information about it, and expand and maybe fine tune even further. And they were met with people that were like, it's not ready. We're not there yet. And they were talking to each other back at the office and saying, no, this works. We've run all the numbers. This works. And then they would go out to another one and nope, it's not ready. You don't understand. And they were like, you know what? It's ready. And you know what? We're just going to go do this ourselves. And so that was really the start of that company, is that two guys going, no, we've done this, and we can do this. And so it's that dogged persistence that a lot of us learn about in business, you know, or frankly, a lot of our professions. You know, a lot of us have been told no, 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 and it's just because we've got tenacity that we carry on and that we make it happen. And that's what Darcy did. She carried on, by golly, and she made it happen. And then, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, and then you find out in different companies, some companies are totally driven by a biomimetic or bio-inspired idea, like InCycle. And in other companies, it finds a different level. You know, it might just be in a library where the creatives can go for inspiration, or it might be as an interface. Okay, we're going to go net zero. Okay, no, now we're going to be regenerative. You know, and so every company, just like we are all individuals and have our own ways of moving through the world, companies have their own ways of moving through the world.
That's right. That's right. And I noticed in the chat that I don't know if it was before you told the story of Darcy or just after, but Darcy just joined us.
Oh,
So
good.
welcome.
Say hi.
Maybe give a wave, Darcy. We were just singing your praises. You probably felt your ears itch and had to come on. Darcy was a pioneer.
No, I didn't hear the story. I just jumped on. Great to see you both.
Margo was just telling the story about your tenacity at Nike and how you were the first sustainabilist there and the first woman working in the women's area, and how there was so much drive, and that's a lot of those characteristics are what also allowed you to bring biomimicry forward. And I think it's important, Margo, like you're saying, businesses fail, and I think, you know, there could be some pushback on this, right? Entrepreneurship is hard. Businesses do fail often. So I could imagine somebody saying, doesn't trying to also save the planet and adding this additional burden onto, doesn't it just add an additional burden onto what it takes to make a company successful? Why go the extra mile with biomimicry when it's hard enough?
You know, that probably was a question at a different level. You know, when Henry Ford was, you know, putting those cars on a line and starting to do, people were like, you know, we've never done it that way. Why should we try something new? And I mean, at this point in time, we're so far ahead of that. But another whole conversation could be had about how much change has gone on since the Industrial Revolution. And so that now really all of creation is knocking us in the head and saying, you better not ignore nature. And so woe to us if we do ignore nature. So, and I think that there are enough of us who are scientists and have seen, you know, the handwriting on the wall. And there are now enough companies who have become enlightened. They are now teaching in business school the triple bottom line. Not every business school, but more and more every day. And so that people are understanding. I mean, going back to Bridgestone, in working with Greer, who I quote a lot in the book, you know, in fact, I'll read you something that he said.
I was just going to read you something that you said, but I'll wait my turn.
Oh, he said, oh, I don't have it here. Oh, yeah, here we go. He said, and this is Bridgestone, multinational tire company. We created a value structure that created the continuum from saving resources like fuel to supporting environmental education to saving wild spaces. We manage our own habitat sites thoughtfully and humbly. So they look at that whole continuum. You know, they worked in Canada, creating books on butterflies, and in Mexico too. And that was the first family-oriented butterfly book that was created from community members, with community members, you know, in Mexico. They supported and support river organizations here. And they are one of the companies who have also moved further and started protecting land for land's sake. Now, some companies are protecting land because it's good PR. They bought and protected thousands of acres because it was the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And they also have habitats and work with the wildlife habitat, or the Habitat Protection Council, another nonprofit, on how to manage each of their sites. And I've been to those sites and looked at the wonderful habitats that they've created around their business centers. So these companies can, and Tony, you were talking about we were talking about Sharklet a while ago, and I'm going to throw this in because it's new. So you guys are hearing it here first. I was on the phone with Tony the other day with the Biomimicry Institute, and we were getting ready, and he held up this baby bottle, and he was like, Sharklet, and they have started putting Sharklet on the nipples of baby bottles and pacifiers for baby bottles, and he's excited about this. Sure, I'm sure as a business person, but he's also just excited about this because he's a good guy and excited to, now they're putting it on yoga mats too. And I was like, how can I get one of those yoga mats? And so I think, they started them first for PR, as a lot of things do. But I'm trying to talk them into
services that would benefit from their bacteria shedding technology.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to read a quote from you this is on page 29 in your book. You said, this is how you're constantly challenging business people. How can you approach problem solving with the intent to build not only a better widget, but a better world, embracing the ethos of reciprocity, as well as working in conjunction with other living organisms? And at a different point, you talk about nature being a business partner. Little, if any, professional training taught us anything about considering nature as a business partner and mentor. Who knew how profitable that partnership could be at so many levels? So this is the kind of context that you're coming from, and continually asking people to kick the tires with these things in mind. I do want to open up for some time for either some questions from the group or some questions from the chat. And I did see, this was not yet a public question, but very early on, Vicky Gottlieb wrote and asked, trying to find it, really for you to speak to. Do you have any connection with Margaret Wheatley's work, the work that she's done for business? She's worked with biology and applied it to management and breakthroughs in business culture and communication. Those are some similar things we're doing with BSI. Have you interfaced on that side of the business application of nature yet?
I have not, but her book is in my tall stack of books to read.
It's called Leadership and the New Science. It's her book. Yeah. Well, you might enjoy it.
Yeah.
And it's I want to circle back to kind of pull on that thread a little bit about you and your leadership if we have some time afterwards. But let's see if here's a kind of a similar question from Emily. Do you see biomimicry being embraced in businesses' structures and practices beyond the products or services that they're providing? An example could be the decentralization of decision-making power in the spirit of life's principles, or maybe companies setting up their structures so they can adapt in new ways and attune to their specific contexts. Have you seen any examples of that?
Well, Toby, you would be the best person to speak to that, because your whole company is based around social innovation.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I have seen and experienced, a guy named Bill at Interface, he's like, when I picked up Janine's book on biomimicry, I learned something completely different than what everybody else was getting from this book. I got that we all have a niche. We all inhabit a niche, and we can do in the company what nobody else can. And that was without me prompting him about anything having to do with habitat or niches or whatnot. That was where he took it.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, these things do come up. Mutualism. We early on, when I was involved with biomimicry, we talked a lot about survival of the fittest, but that conversation pivoted fairly quickly to discuss mutualism. Mm-hmm. and how most of what we do is formed around mutualism and working with each other and providing partnership or services, whatever name you want to put on it, with and for each other. And that's how companies work.
Yeah.
They don't work, unless you're a single owner. But if you're a company of any size, you have to have all those pieces working together. And so there is a kind of mutualism that takes place.
And
But
many folks on this call know, maybe not everybody, that is the work that Biomimicry for Social Innovation is involved in. What are the practices that we can take inside? And we partnered with Biomimicry 3.8 to do a case study with an organization called Canopy, an NGO that's involved in Canada and around the world protecting rainforests. They work a lot in partnership, and they asked us, how does nature retain partnership over long periods of time, even in the face of disruption? And so we went into the mutualism literature. We surfaced 180 different examples of cross-species mutualisms and looked very deeply at those patterns. What exists in every one of those? What are the deep patterns of mutualisms in the natural world that we can translate to the human world and apply to decision-making, partnership building, how do we work together inside a company and across companies or organizations? And we came up with that there are 4 key criteria that all of them have. And we don't have time today to talk about that, but that's the kind of thing that we're starting to do. I think this is a front edge of biomimicry. And others on this call, I know Lori Antonucci is involved in these kinds of questions too. How do we work with leadership? And how do we work with business practices right alongside the products and the services? It can all be designed in nature's image. Let me see, we have just a few more minutes. I do want to save a little bit of time at the end to reinforce how you can order this book. In fact, maybe Jen, you could put that in the chat right now for folks are like, oh my gosh, I got to get this book. We can give you a link. And also to let you know that let's also put in the code that if you want to, is this still true, Margo, that there's a code that can be put in to get a discount on this from your public?
There's actually 2 codes. There's one, if Jennifer can put it in, that will go to the end of February. And I indicated which one, and the other one starts in March. Regardless of when you buy it, half the proceeds will go to the Biomimicry Institute. But you can get 20% off.
So you get 20% off if you use this code, and no matter when you buy it, half of the proceeds of sales of this book go to the Biomimicry Institute. Thank you for that, Margo. That's, again, ecological reciprocity.
I did beg them. I'm hoping this gets out into a lot of colleges and universities, and I did beg them to keep the book under $40 for students, for the sake of students. And so if any of you have it and notice that the print is a little bit small, they were able to do it for under $40, but the print is kind of small.
I'm wondering if there's anybody in our audience that wants to unmute themselves and raise a hand and ask a question to Margo directly. And the way you would, I can see some of you, but not all of you. If you want to raise your hand technologically, you do that you click on participants, you find yourself, and I think there's a place where you can say, I want to raise my hand. Anybody have a question you'd like to pose or a comment?
Hi. There's also a couple questions in the comments still.
Okay, great. Jen, maybe can you surface those?
Yes, I can. There was a couple questions that were tugging on issues around language. For example, could you talk about the difference between profit and abundance? Profit being put one in, take 2 out, which isn't beneficial to the whole, and how are companies addressing abundance?
One of the things I talk about in the book is that we are taught from a young age to have goals. And that keeps hitting us again and again at every age and every stage and every profession. And one of the things I suggest is that if you are interested in creating a company or working in a company in an arena where you have some impact on how they are doing their business, a first step to move in that direction would be to create your intent. Figure out what your intentions are. And this is one of the things that, even though I only got to know Ray Anderson for just such a short period of time, he was such a wonderful human being. And one of the books that very much influenced him was a book called Ishmael. And in Ishmael, they talk about givers and takers. And he wanted his company to be a company of givers. And so, one of the things that I learned from them is intention, and setting your intention and then create your goals out of that. You can still have fabulous business goals, but you are operating more in a mindset of abundance rather than simply profit. There's profit, and then abundance goes above and beyond that.
Thank you. I'm noticing it's about 3 minutes till the hour, so I want to be sure that those who want to jump off at the end of the hour have all the information that they need. Maybe we could just post the ordering link for the book one more time. Please do buy this book. It is half the proceeds go to the Biomimicry Institute. Another portion of it goes to Margo Farnsworth to continue to do this work, getting these books out into the world. You could buy one and give it as a gift to any folks in your life who might be business people or come from a different kind of perspective than inside the biomimicry world. It's a great gift. Margo, thank you so much for your work, for who you are, for agreeing to come and be part of this, for all the different ways that you serve. Every time I talk with you, I learn a little bit more about your superpowers and how you're spreading them out into the world. And we're just so fortunate to have you with us today and part of this larger community. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I tell you, with the names that I'm seeing and those of you who are tuning in, thank you so much for doing all that I know you are doing. Whether you are a farmer, which I know have a friend here, I see you, Linda, whether you're a farmer, whether you are, your own consultancy company, whether you're a writer, thank all of you, and an investor. Thank all of you for doing the work that you do.
Margo, are you able to stay on for a few extra minutes in case there are folks who want to stay and kind of have a little bit more of an informal conversation?
Sure.
Great. Okay, thank you. To those who need to leave, thank you so much for being part of this. I do want to give a little plug for our next episode of the Voices of Nature author series. We're going to take a little bit of a different turn. I'm actually inviting a novelist to come and be part of this. A woman who's a dear friend of mine named Jamie Figueroa. She's from here in Santa Fe. She's a creative writing professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts and a novelist and an alumna of the Living Systems Leadership Retreat that Biomimicry for Social Innovation does for women to teach leadership practices based on living systems. Jamie was part of that, our last session. And she's written a novel called Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer. And the reason why I particularly wanted Jamie to come is because in this novel, it's set in the Southwest, and the place itself, the natural world itself, is a character and a narrator of the book. So it's a little different spin. When you talked about Ishmael and how much it influenced you, it reminded me that we need all these books that are speaking the voice of the natural world in all the different forms. And sometimes the literary form is an avenue that doesn't get as much attention in these kind of forums. So I wanted to invite Jamie and have her come and be part of this. And she's been doing a lot of thinking about her life, the life of the writer as an ecosystem itself and how to keep that ecosystem thriving. So if you want to be part of that conversation, please come and join us. That is on April 8th. You'll be getting something from BSI about that. And again, so much gratitude that in these times when we're so separate from one another, we can come together with heart and care and deep listening and be in circle like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Margo.
Thank
Keep
you.
this room open for another 15, 20 minutes. We can unmute, we can be in dialogue, you can write things in the chat or just speak up if you want to be in any further conversation about this. And it's so great to see old and new friends. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for another great session, Toby and Margo. How nice to see you. I have to run to another Zoom meeting now, otherwise I'd stay on.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Dorna. Thanks for being part of this.
Take care.
Take care.
Anybody else
While everybody,
have some questions or thoughts you want to share?
Can I ask something, please?
Yes, Mathilde.
So I'm studying materials engineering, and I found out about biomimicry really recently when I was watching some videos on YouTube, and I got really interested, and I was wondering, like, if it was possible to do something related to it. What do you think? Like, connect both areas?
You're studying materials engineering and you're
Yes.
interested in how that can connect with biomimicry. I think there's a lot to say
Yes,
about
I think it can. If you inspire yourself in nature, you can. So I'm thinking of doing something like creating and working on more sustainable materials. So that comes from inspiring ourselves on nature, right?
Yeah.
perfect.
Margo, do you have some examples of that to share with Mathilde that might be useful for her?
Yeah, Mathilde, you are coming along at a really exciting time because that's kind of been the last bastion from my perspective is figuring out the materials, because the Shinkansen train is, you know, a wonderful example, but it still is a giant chunk of metal, you know, and all that goes with it. And one of the life's principles, or, you know, they evolve and we call them different things over time, is to create products out of life-friendly materials. And to quote Dana Baumeister, paraphrase a quote here, she says, just because we have a giant table of elements doesn't mean we have to use everything on there. And so using as few elements as we can, and being conservative, you know, with our materials. I don't know if Darcy is still on, but I'm going to tell a story on Darcy. When she was working for Nike still, and she went over to Asia, and there was a very pregnant line worker, and through translation and whatnot, Darcy was able to ask her, you know, does the smell in here bother you? They were at a shoe factory where they were putting the soles together. And the gal said, only on Sunday. And that raised a flag in Darcy's head that something was amiss. So she went back to their chemistry department, and they had been thinking about this. She's careful not to say that she started it, although, you know, she probably was the catalyst. But they came up with a green chemistry that let them take about 90% of the quote unquote bad stuff, you know, out of their process. So they were able to vastly improve it. And then this is another reason I've got to say once again, business is not all bad, you know, and the question that someone asked about moving to abundance, intellectual property is never shared among companies. It's just not done. And Mr. Crosby knew that this was something they had to share with the other companies, the other sporting good companies, because they were all had their shoes with their being put together in that same factory. So if they would have just kept that intellectual property to themselves, they would have still been, you know, harming people. But they had a higher cause. They had a perspective of abundance, and they shared that intellectual property with all the other companies so that they could move collectively to a better place and take care of the human beings that they were working in concert with to provide our shoes. But there are a number of places. And if you look at Warner Babcock, Mr. Warner has worked with Janine a lot and is very much on the cutting edge of green chemistry and bioutilization. There are companies like Interface that are looking at how we can utilize algae for different things. So you've got exciting things in front of you.
And Mathilde, the essence of the biomimicry process is to figure out what you're trying to, the challenge you're trying to solve. So maybe with the materials, you're wanting something to be flexible, or you're wanting something to be water repellent, or you're wanting a surface to be lightweight, but transparent. And then you would ask, well, how would nature do that? How does nature do that? And research all the organisms that do those same things, and then start to think about how to apply that to your challenge. That's kind of the essence of the biomimetic process. Margo, Doug put in the chat, what was the Sunday reference with your story about Darcy's shoe factory? She said only on Sunday.
Only on Sunday, because in East Asia, they work 6 days a week. So Sunday she was home, and that's when she would get headaches. And that just wasn't, Darcy knew there's something up here. And so she took it back and they made the changes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good. I'm seeing a couple other questions here. Michelle says she's trying to figure ways to incorporate biomimicry into digital design, but I struggle with the balance between organizations trying to keep users engaged onto their devices versus her wanting to encourage users to get off their devices. Any thoughts?
Well, there again, I think I would go back to, what are your intentions? What kind of a value do you want to create? And let yourself be driven from that space. Is it valuable for us to be on our devices a third of our lives? We all get those, or I get those tickers, a number of us get those tickers that say, your use is up 25% this week, or your use is down 25% this week. And I think we really do have to come from a place of, what are our values and what are our intentions? And then from there, move into the goals of how you can, and then, it is, as you just were talking about, Toby, how would nature communicate? And thinking further on, what does nature communicate? What are the things that nature communicates? And so that's a lot to think about right there. It takes me back to when we've all learned that the language we've been raised on is the language of maximization, and nature operates on the language of optimization. And there is no waste, or so little compared to our human, maximization thought processes and drive. That's why we have additive manufacturing now, is because we started asking that question. One of the reasons. Sorry, don't mean to be so global.
Toby, I think Marcelo has a question that he'd like addressed.
Let me just quick touch base on Lou's question on my way to Marcelo. Lou is asking, love to hear from Margo about how we could learn from nature on building communities and promote cooperative behaviors within the groups. Oh, and I see, Jennifer, you responded saying that's what Biomimicry for Social Innovation does. We do. Margo, do you want to speak to that at all?
There's one really exciting example. And if you look up a guy named Juan Ravallo, he worked with a community at one point, and the example that I can think of is when they were looking at where they were going to invest. Nature, I live in an area where we're moving out onto the prairie. and we have deciduous forest, and that connection, that ecotone, is where so much goes on. And Juan and his team said that's where we want to invest. We want to invest in those junctures. So that's one example. And Toby, you probably have a myriad.
Well, yeah, I think it is a great question, and it's really important about, and what I referred to before about the mutualisms and the strategies around mutualisms informs that. How do we build communities and promote cooperative behaviors between the groups? And there's so much that the natural world can teach us, because even though we have designed human systems to be very separate and isolated in many cases, and we have this idea that the natural world is all about competition because we watched all those nature shows, in truth, there's very little competition in the natural world, and it tends to be short, and it may be around mate selection. But most of what happens in the natural world is finding ways to avoid conflict. There's a lot of posturing, but mostly it's about finding niche differentiation within a community and building the connectedness in the community. If you're interested in diving more deeply into that work, I do encourage you to look at the Biomimicry for Social Innovation website. And also, we do a workshop for women leaders every year called Living Systems Leadership. And I'll just give a little image here. We've distilled 6 practices from nature that are based on life's principles, that are kind of the fundamental practices that leaders can apply to be acting in ways that are more in tune with the natural world. I don't know if you can see these across the Zoom screen or not, but one of them is cultivate cooperative relationships, and attuning to local context, and self-organizing using simple rules. And what we do in those workshops is we go out into nature, we learn from nature about these practices. How does nature do it? And then everybody who's in the workshop has an opportunity with support to translate that into their own business or organization or leadership or community, and come out with some applicable ways to take nature's intelligence and apply it to the kinds of things that we're trying to do in the, how do we live together here in sustainable ways? Can we learn that from the planet itself? I think we can. Thank you for that question. And Marcelo.
Thank you.
Marcelo asks, Margo, how do you envision the future in the coming decades? From my understanding, most of the biomimetic applications are for the industry. How can we deliver tangible biomimetic products to end customers? Tangible biomimetic products to end customers.
If we're talking about the delivery of products, you know, we are talking about business. But my hope for the future is, and thank you for all these questions, you all, and for this question, I hope that more and more colleges and universities want to deploy biomimicry in their business classes, in their engineering classes, in their design classes. Some of the most excited audiences that I've had are interior designers. And then if we can get, that's talking at the professional level. And then if we can get our work out further in the university and college level, and I know that Dorna was here earlier, a writer of children's books. So what I hope to see in the future is that we begin to integrate biomimicry and all its cousins at every layer of education.
Beautiful, thank you. And I think our final question is from Doug. And Doug, I'm guessing that you have some answers to this question yourself. Food for business thought. How does nature build community to facilitate the exchange of resources and information? So that's a great way to enter into a biomimetic exploration. How does nature, we're trying to facilitate, build community so that resources and information can be better shared. How does nature do that? And Doug, why don't you unmute yourself? I'm wondering if you can think of any examples from the natural world where that's going on.
Well, actually, my inspiration for this started after I attended your social innovation workshop in Montana, Toby, because I was always thinking about how do I apply biomimicry to my business, which is brand strategy and design. And so, to try to find it's all about context too, because the other big part of biomimicry is the context, like you said. Is it flexible? Is it hot? So trying to find a match for the ecosystem. Is it a type 1 ecosystem, a type 2 ecosystem? Is it something, is it a regenerative kind of system, which most are, and then finding the organisms that thrive in there provide really great examples for particular types of business strategies or business brands or whatever you're trying to solve for, because if, are you a new brand in a new market? Are you an existing brand in an existing market? You can find matches for that, but I think you can apply that. And it's the system thinking piece of that, I think, that provides a lot of the answers. And because I don't know, it's just fascinating to me. That opened up a whole new kind of biomimicry door. And it's like and every time you take another turn, you're going into a, or I should say, every time you go around another tree, you're finding, different places to do research and to find answers. It's just, but to me, that frames up, and it's, it takes it out of the competitive situation as well and puts it more into an exchange. And it's more because that's what business is. It's the exchange of resources. And so there's tons of models in nature that do that. And you got to find the one that fits your particular circumstance.
That's right. And when we start remembering that nature is an interconnected web that is all about exchanging resources and information, and there are some organisms in particular that facilitate that, like a mycelial fungal network. And there are other whole systems that are their very nature is to facilitate resources and information. So how do we start to act like those systems? Can you share any particular examples, Doug, in your own exploration of how you found it useful for your brand strategy business?
It's just we do like workshops for trying to help people just to kind of introduce them to biomimicry and thinking, and it's just in using examples of and it's just kind of what I alluded to. If it's people who are trying to figure out how to promote or what's a good strategy for a brand that's totally new ideas, and so we'll find examples of like keystone species that really excel in a given environment, and then try to find what are those behaviors that they use to make them thrive in that environment. Like, I'm struggling now trying to come up with an exact example, but that's just the kind of, and it's a lot more metaphorical, obviously, than doing material science work, but it also, it starts your head thinking in a whole different direction, and it gives you ideas that you may not have thought of. And it's just a way to open up your thinking, open up your, reconnect to stuff that's been there that maybe is dormant that you just need to reconnect to. So I don't know.
So Doug, one of the things that I would say, maybe to partner in with what you're thinking about, and what you and Toby are talking about systems, is the first graduate student I worked with on an international design challenge came to a place where he was ready to work in systems. And I created a model. I didn't. Nature created these models. I just happened to put it into words. But it was, you can look at a group of internal systems, like what the human body has,
Right.
and how those all interface with each other and add to and provide different services and whatnot. You can look at adjacent systems. And again, I'll use that prairie butting up against the forest, or unlike organisms like mycelium and how they interface with trees.
Right.
And so, but they're adjacent. They are not the same organism. And then even something fun to do and sometimes useful is looking at disconnected systems. So taking something from, you have decided what needs to happen in your ecosystem, and then taking the best of what you can find that organisms are offering, and then look at how those might interface with each other.
Oh, yeah.
And so those might be, 3 different ways of looking at systems that might be fun and even profitable for you, help you create abundance in your branding business.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Margo.
Thank
I just see
you.
one more question from Michelle, who says, I don't know if there's time for one more question. And Michelle, with your permission, I'm going to reframe your question a little bit. And I think it might be a good question to close with, because Margo, I know this is something that's very important to you. The question, as Michelle stated it, is, given how rapidly humans are destroying these natural sources of inspiration to learn biomimicry, what would happen to the biomimicry practice if we lose this source? And my reframe on this question, if you, with your permission, please forgive me, is given how critical these sources of inspiration are, what can you speak to, Margo, from your own experience and your own thinking about the importance of conserving these sources of biomimetic intelligence? And I know you've put a lot of thought into that, how conservation and innovation for conservation program, and how critical conserving habitats and organisms and landscapes is to the future of this work and a business, because there's so much that we have yet to even know we need to discover from these organisms. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So thanks, Michelle. And there's 2 things here. One is looking at the ways that we can give back and how we can create reciprocity with the natural world. And for those companies like Bridgestone and Disney and individuals like the past CEO of Patagonia, who bought up vast acreages for conservation in South America. So there's that whole way of preservation, looking at preservation and approaching that, and conservation. Then there's the other way, in your business. And I think that's kind of where your most excellent question came from. And I would hearken back to that life principle, saying that we need to use life-friendly practices. We usually think about this when we're thinking about the chemistry of a product, but it really speaks to what you're talking about too, that when we start seeing that these elements are disappearing, I'll try to refrain from using the term resources, but when we see that these elements are disappearing, we need to shine a light on that and say, okay, if they're disappearing, then it's no longer life friendly. And we need to look at a different way of doing the work that we're doing, because that is, we would do that, and nature would do that, or an extinction would occur.
Beautiful.
So we can choose.
Thank you, Margo. I also want to lift up Jennifer's response about looking to indigenous cultures and traditional technologies. And it's just reminding me of our last Voices of Nature series with Melissa Nelson, where she talked about how there's so much for us to learn from traditional ecological knowledge about being in a reciprocal relationship with the natural world. And Margo, I think you're challenging the business community to be in a reciprocal relationship with the natural world, so that business itself is life affirming, and so that our business practices are life friendly. So there's lots of ways in on this. Thank you. And thank you for that question, Michelle. I think it is time for us to wrap this up. Again, beautiful.